Welcome to this session on Illuminating Hidden Harvests, the contribution of small-scale fishery to sustainable development. I can see we have one participant that has joined so far, so let's give it a couple of minutes and see if we'll have more coming on. For you that just joined, welcome to this session on the Illuminating Hidden Harvests. We're just giving people a couple of minutes to be able to join. So welcome again, let's get started. Maybe more people will join. We have a quite small group so far, but that could also mean we could have a nice discussion. So this is a session on the Illuminating Hidden Harvest, contribution of small-scale fishery to sustainable development. And we're very excited to present a first look at some of the key results from this study, the Illuminating Hidden Harvest, that we also call the IHH initiative for short. The IHH is intended to inform all levels of policymakers and processes and to contribute to empowering small-scale fishing communities and their organizations and those that advocate for small-scale fisheries to make a strong case for why we want to support productive, sustainable and equitable small-scale fisheries. In this way, the IHH initiative supports the implementation of the Voluntary Guidelines for securing small-scale fisheries in the context of food security and poverty eradication, or the SSF guidelines that we call them. And they also contribute towards progress to the Sustainable Development Goals. This study has been ongoing for more than 4 years by now, and we are close to finalizing the report that will be out later in this year, which is the International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture. So it's very timely that we would publish the report in this important year for small-scale fisheries. We have 3 presentations today, and after that we would have time for questions and answers by our panelists. So if there are questions, please note them down and we can have them then in a discussion after the presentations. Now, before we start proper, I'd like to show a video, which would also then give a chance perhaps to other people to join. So let me share my screen.
The contribution of small-scale fishery to sustainable development are often undervalued or overlooked.
This results in missed opportunities to progress the Sustainable Development Goals.
And in the worst instances, small-scale fisher and fish workers experiencing increased marginalization
and exclusion from governance, spaces, and resources.
The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, or FAO, Duke University, and the WorldFish team up in 2017 to help address this issue
by launching the Illuminating Hidden Harvests Global Initiative.
This initiative will help to further improve methods and capacities to collect, analyze, and use data in support of small-scale fisheries.
As the basis for sound and inclusive policymaking and resource governance.
A major output of this initiative is a research report
that uses a multidisciplinary approach
to assess and broaden our understanding of the values of marine and inland small-scale fisheries globally.
The report looks holistically at small-scale fisheries and their contributions to
the environment, livelihoods and the well-being,
nutrition,
households and global economies,
fisheries governance. Across all this, we paid particular attention to the role of women
and the gender aspects of small-scale fisheries.
The Illuminating Hidden Harvest team developed a rigorous methodology.
In-country experts used this methodology to look beyond official sources of fisheries data
to collect and synthesize information about small-scale fisheries. for 58 country and territory case studies spanning
Africa,
Asia,
Oceania,
Europe,
and the Americas.
Countries were prioritized based on the importance of their fishery sector
in terms of employment, production, and nutrition.
All researchers attended one-on-one training sessions on the Illuminating Hidden Harvest methodology,
covering data gathering, compilation, and documentation.
A network of 28 gender advisors was engaged alongside some of the country teams
to ensure that women's contributions to small-scale fisheries were elevated in the research.
The report consisted of other comprehensive data harvesting techniques, including
a questionnaire responded to by 104 FAO member countries,
a review of national datasets on labor force and household income and expenditure survey,
and an assessment of fisheries policies and the FAO LEX database.
We work with expert teams to highlight important themes,
shining the needed light on issues such as indigenous people,
and the importance of identity in understanding fishers and fish workers' choices.
Thanks to the contributions of more than 800 experts,
new and clear insights are coming to the surface,
adding to the growing body of evidence around small-scale fisheries.
We will continue to develop new methods and capacities for better data collection in the future,
that governments, researchers, and others can apply and refine.
Critically, the Illuminating Hidden Harvests knowledge will support the implementation of the small-scale fisheries guidelines
by providing key information to organizations and athletes.
To make a strong case for productive, sustainable, and equitable small-scale fisheries for all.
So welcome back. That was sorry about that. That was the next video wanting to play. I'm now wanting to move on to our presentations, and I'm really happy to introduce Maria del Mar Mancha-Cisneros to provide us with the background to the IHH study and its purpose and approach. So Mar completed her postdoctoral position at Duke University, where she worked as the technical lead for the study, building the data set. So she will be really well placed to talk to this theme. Mar is now a Sustainable Seafood Program Manager at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego. Over to you, Mar.
Thank you, Lena, and good afternoon, everyone. As Lena mentioned, my name is Mar, and I will be presenting on the methodology and the approach overall for the Illuminating Hidden Harvests approach. Well, yeah, I'm going to start with an overview of the IHH study, as we call it for short, because the basis of the study is recognizing that small-scale fisheries are complex socio-ecological systems. Therefore, IHH took a multidisciplinary approach, which is closely embedded within the Sustainable Development Goals framework, as we can see from the figure, as well as the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries, and particularly as a response to a call for better data within the guidelines. Particularly, IHH looks at the contributions of small-scale fisheries to the three pillars of sustainable development, that is economic, social, and environmental, with a strong focus on nutrition and governance, and with gender as a cross-cutting dimension. The main data source for the study was a series of 58 case studies that were carried out in the countries and territories that you see highlighted in the map, which were selected according to a series of indicators and that accounted for 68% of the global marine catch and 62% of the global inland catch according to FAO data. The country and territory case studies were carried out by national research institutes, fisheries organizations, local and international fisheries experts for a total of more than 800 contributors, with the objective to compile available data and information on small-scale fisheries at country level. That is including official statistics, surveys, expert knowledge, etc., and following a standard protocol provided by the IHH team. Gender focal points were also identified within the countries and territories to support the case studies experts on the data collection, to flush out all available data on knowledge on gender and small-scale fisheries, including gender disaggregated information, to estimate contributions by women and men in small-scale fisheries, for example, in terms of labor, and highlight specific gaps and limitations in the available data. Other data sources that were used to complement and fill gaps, as well as triangulate country case study information, were responses to an ad hoc questionnaire on small-scale fisheries specifically, that was sent to FAO member countries and territories, for which we received 104 responses as well. Existing global and regional databases were used as well, literature reviews, labor force surveys, and household income and expenditure surveys, for example. And finally, specific thematic studies were also carried out in order to highlight key aspects of small-scale fisheries that cannot be quantified at a global level, for example, a study on indigenous peoples and identity. As we all know, there is no internationally agreed definition of small-scale fisheries. Oh, apologies. Yeah, there is an international definition of small-scale fisheries. Therefore, what we used in the IHH study, we did not prescribe a definition for it. Instead, our country case study experts were instructed to use the most commonly used definition for the subsector in their country for data compilation. However, the IHH study did use a tool called the characterization matrix that allowed to score each fishery included in the study according to a series of characteristics, such as gear used, motorization, distance from shore, etc., and to place them along the continuum between small-scale and large-scale fisheries in order to give a better sense of what we are really looking at when we talk about small-scale fisheries in the study. And finally, the data compiled through the different approaches were analyzed and extrapolated to produce global estimates of the key indicators, such as catch and employment, but also used to gain better insights on issues that are very important for small-scale fisheries at different spatial scales, such as the national or subnational level, in addition to those aspects highlighted in the thematic studies that cannot be quantified at global level, yet recognizing the high diversity of small-scale fisheries. We also had a technical advisory group who advised on the design, analysis, and interpretation of the IHH work all throughout the study. And as mentioned earlier, IHH took a multidisciplinary approach illustrated by this diagram and put a stress on the interconnections among the different dimensions and related questions in order to draw a holistic picture of small-scale fisheries to highlight their overall contributions, benefits, and impacts, and by looking at the data through the lens of different disciplines at the same time. Starting to address key questions such as how much fish comes from small-scale fisheries? How many people depend on small-scale fisheries for their livelihoods? How do women contribute to and benefit from small-scale fisheries? How important are small-scale fisheries catch for nutrition? And how are small-scale fisheries governed? So just to give you a snapshot of the results we found for at the global level, we found that 37 million tons, or 40% of the global catch, originates from small-scale fisheries. And for the contribution to employment, of which I'm sure John will speak more in detail, the number of people at least partially dependent on small-scale fisheries was up to 492 million. In terms of the substantial labor contributions by women to small-scale fisheries, we were also able to provide a more robust set of gender disaggregated data, which show that an estimated 45 million women participate in small-scale fisheries value chains globally, which represents 40% of the total estimated small-scale fisheries labor. So for every 10 people that participate, in small-scale fisheries for are women that are either working for pay or fishing for home consumption. We also found that small fish from small-scale fisheries are often particularly important for nutrition, that the fish from small-scale fisheries have the potential to make considerable contributions to nutrition, and can be very important in the diets of vulnerable rural population groups, notably children. And finally, for the governance dimensions based on marine and inland catch, with governance data for the 58 countries and territories that we used, we found that for every 2 of 10 metric tons of catch, there is a perception by experts that there is high participation of fishers where implementation is thought to be happening. So with this big picture overview of some of these key findings at the global scale, I will leave it here and give time for our next speakers who will go into more detail on some of the aspects of the IHH approach and the findings. Over to you, Lena.
Thank you very much, Mar, for that very comprehensive overview on the study and how it was carried out. We will now hear from John Verdin on one of the aspects that was part of the IHH study, which is the economic dimension, the economic and livelihoods dimension of small-scale fisheries. John is the director of the Oceans and Coastal Policy Program at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University, aiming to connect science and ideas to help policymakers solve ocean sustainability problems. Like Mar, John is part of the IHH core team and was co-leading the analysis of the economic and livelihoods dimension of small-scale fisheries. John, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Lena. And it's a pleasure to join you all today. As you mentioned, I just wanted to say at the outset that I'm sharing some of these results from our focus on the economic contributions of small-scale fisheries on behalf of Nicole Franz, who co-led this with me, and this large team that you see here, all of whom were involved in this study and this analysis. So on behalf of a number of folks. But just briefly wanted to share some of the key findings that we had from looking at the economic contributions of small-scale fisheries, and in particular, how many people are employed in small-scale fisheries. Mar mentioned this earlier. It is one of the most frequent socioeconomic indicators that we ask for in understanding the role of small-scale fisheries in society. How important are small-scale fisheries to societies is how many people are participating in small-scale fisheries, how many people are employed. So we looked at that and we found, as you see here, a number of 60 million people employed, which again, this has been asked before, but we asked it of a relatively new source of data. We had national household-based surveys from 78 countries around the world that we used and aggregated and drew from to get this global estimate of 60 million people employed, equivalent to about 90% of all employment in capture fisheries coming from small-scale fisheries. But these surveys have told us a little bit more beyond just employment as well, which employment for some form of pay or remuneration. They've also told us about how many other people, how many more people participate in small-scale fisheries, at least 1 hour a year just for subsistence, or at least one time a year just for subsistence. And so this has given us a sense that, okay, 60 million people worldwide are employed in small-scale fisheries. An additional 53 million people participate at least once during the year for subsistence, for a total of 113 million people around the world who are either employed in small-scale fisheries or, depending upon them, it's in some form for subsistence, for their own consumption of fish and seafood. And then we look beyond that. We were able to use these surveys to see how many household members are with these 113 million people, and find an additional 379 million household members that we could say at least partially depend upon small-scale fisheries for their livelihoods. Of course, some of these other household members may have additional sources of employment, so we can't say they're fully dependent, but at least partially dependent upon small-scale fisheries for the total that Mar mentioned earlier, 492 million people, depending at least partially on small-scale fisheries, whether they're commercially employed, part-time or full-time in small-scale fisheries, whether they're engaged in small-scale fisheries for subsistence, or they're household members of someone who is. Gives us a total of 492 million people for the year 2016. That was the year that we had this data, this snapshot for. And that's a pretty big number. That's equivalent to 7% of the global population in 2016. And then if we focus on the least developed countries, according to the UN, that number is higher. It's 13% of the population in least developed countries, reflecting higher rates of participation in small-scale fisheries in some of the lower income countries around the world. Now, beyond employment, beyond participation in small-scale fisheries, as a measure of the size of the economic production from small-scale fisheries, we looked at what are the total revenues from the first sale of the catch? What is the economic value of the production from small-scale fisheries, at least at the harvesting stage? And this is essentially if you take the catch and you multiply it by the price of the first sale, this gets you the annual total revenues from the catch that we estimated to be 77 billion globally, from which about 58 billion come from marine small-scale fisheries and 19 billion from inland small-scale fisheries. Now, we didn't have large-scale fisheries to compare to globally, but in the countries where we had case studies, in these 58 countries that Mar mentioned, on average, small-scale fisheries generated about 44% of the total revenues from the first sale of the catch. So if you're just looking at the economic value of the production from fisheries, at least from the harvesting segment, small-scale fisheries generated a pretty significant portion in all of these 58 countries that we studied. And we would expect to find something significant at the global level, but we didn't have that calculation globally. What we did have globally, just to give a little bit more context to this number, as we just said, there's a lot of talk about the ocean economy, all of this various economic activity linked to the ocean space. Often small-scale fisheries aren't included in this dialogue. But if we just look at the first sale or the revenues from the harvesting segment, the first sale of the catch, they place marine small-scale fisheries pretty squarely in the middle here of some of the biggest ocean-based industries. Certainly far smaller than oil and gas or shipping, but for example, bigger than cruise tourism, ports, offshore wind. And this is, of course, just the harvesting segment. This isn't the post-harvest segment of marine small-scale fisheries. So that just gives you a little bit more context of the size of the production value, the economic value of the production from small-scale fisheries. We've looked at some other things that you'll see in the final report in the economic chapter. The role of small-scale fisheries in international trade. There are a number of case studies suggesting differing portions of the contribution of small-scale fisheries to international trade. We've tried to do a deeper dive into this question of subsistence fishing, understanding the characteristics of not only how much subsistence fishing is occurring in countries, but what types of livelihoods this is supporting, complementing, how prevalent is it in different places. And then we've tried to dig into these employment and subsistence data even further by segment of the value chain and by gender for inland and marine small-scale fisheries in different cases. So we go into much more detail, of course, in the chapter, but this just gives you a little bit of a flavor of some of the key findings and some of the things that we've tried to look at here. And with that, I will say thanks and pass back to you, Lena.
Thank you very much, John. Certainly some quite impressive numbers there. And thanks for giving us that insight into the economics and livelihoods part of the IHH study. Now I have the pleasure to introduce to you Joshua Stahl, who will tell us about his experience from preparing one of the country case studies. So Josh was in fact the lead expert for the IHA country case study in the US. So he knows the challenges of bringing all this small-scale fisheries data together for a country. Josh is an assistant professor of marine policy in the School of Marine Sciences at the University of Maine. His research focuses on questions about ocean governance, fisheries policy, and food systems. Josh is also the co-founder of the Local Catch Network and has been working to elevate the role of seafood in local and regional food systems for more than a decade. Josh, over to you, please.
Thanks so much. It's nice to be here. Let me just get my slides up here. In contrast to John's presentation that has lots of big text and big numbers, mine's going to have a lot of smaller numbers and smaller text. Like Lena said, my name is Josh Stahl, and I'm an assistant professor in the School of Marine Sciences at the University of Maine. And I had the privilege of getting to do one of the case studies focused on the US and small-scale fisheries. And this work was funded by the Oak Foundation. And I want to specifically call out two of my graduate students who worked on this, Sarah Risley and Paloma Henriquez, who contributed quite a bit to the data collection process. I wanted to start by sort of sharing my experience by starting with this image of the Fish Stock Sustainability Index. In the US, this is essentially the Dow Jones of fisheries, and it's used to describe the state of our fisheries and how they're doing. For the purposes of this presentation, I don't need to go into the context of how this data is calculated, but want to give you a sense of sort of the general trajectory of fisheries and how it's being portrayed to Congress and sort of nationally with this slope moving from the lower left to the upper right. And it gives a pretty positive impression of the state of fisheries in the US. And in some ways, I strongly agree with that. But for many of those who are engaged in fisheries, the story is quite a bit different. And it looks something like this. This is a photo from Eastern North Carolina that I think captures a lot of the challenges that small-scale operators face across the US, but certainly in places like this. The aging of the working waterfront, the aging of the fleet, the conflict with land use, and so on and so forth. And those impacts have been pretty transformative. This is an image from Morehead City in Eastern North Carolina in the 1950s, a fleet of Menhaden boats. Today, the same marina looks like this. And again, the transformation is pretty stunning. Part of why I was excited and inspired to contribute to this major global effort is because of this need to tell a different story, to better understand the lived experiences of many coastal fishing communities that are engaged in small-scale fisheries. And this provided an opportunity for me to learn and my team to learn and contribute to this global effort. And so I want to spend my time today sharing a little of some of the results from the work that we've done, but also before doing that, making a couple observations from this work and sort of the experience of building this data set. So the first observation is relates to this idea of defining small-scale fisheries in the US context. I would say one of the themes of this conference to date has been around how do you define key terms like small scale? And in the US, there is no formal definition of small scale. And so our approach in order to collect data on small-scale fisheries started by understanding building a set of definitions for small scale. And we did that using a Delphi method where we went out and conducted a set of interviews with fisheries experts across the US to say, what does small scale mean to you, into your regional context, to the national context. And then through that, paired those responses to the FAO's small scale fisheries matrix. And what emerged from that process was a set of 5 characteristics that we ended up using to bound our study and to bound the case study in the US. And those related to length of fishing vessels, length of fishing trip, size of crew, distance from shore, and business structure. One of the interesting things is while there was quite a bit of consensus on these 5 variables, there are diverse perspectives on what those bounds or what those thresholds should be. For example, here on the right side, these are the various circles represent the different scales at which people viewed through that threshold, that outer threshold. And for some of these characteristics, people would say anything from no vessel, small scale was no vessel involved, all the way out to something that could potentially be greater than 24 meters. And so again, there's different contexts. The US is a large place, but people had diverse perspectives, and by and large, there wasn't consensus. And so as a result of that, rather than picking a single definition that we use to extract data and to analyze our case study, we ended up essentially developing a typology with 3 types of small scale fishing, which we show in this table on the right. One thing that I will point out is that many definitions of small scale around the world include an emphasis on gear type, and in particular, the lack of trawl gear. One thing that I'll point out here in the definitions that we developed in the US context, that wasn't a priority, although you'll see in a moment that we ended up using that as one of the lenses to analyze our data. The second observation that I wanted to share and sort of the experience from doing this work relates to data format and data availability. I came into this project with the naive assumption that it would be relatively easy to compile these data in a place like the US, given the long history of quote unquote science-based fisheries management. And I can't emphasize how wrong I was in that assumption. And part of that has to do with the fragmented nature of data and the way that we collect data in the US. It's often at a state level or at a regional level. And so when you're trying to do national assessments and stitch those things together, there are all kinds of challenges. A second challenge related to this is that there's often the way that data is collected and the scale at which data is collected is it ultimately misaligned with the emergent definition of small scale fisheries. And then there are major gaps in things like ownership and participation. For example, we often keep track of number of vessels in the US and participating in a fishery, but we don't actually keep track of the number of people in a particular fishery. And so you can make some estimates on a fishery by fishery basis, but the data don't speak to each other. So if one participant participates in the Maine lobster fishery and somebody else also participates in the Maine scallop fishery, there's often no way for those data to speak to each other, which makes it quite difficult to get an exact estimate on participation. In the end of our process, through a lot of engagement with states and regional, national government, we ended up defining just over 1,000 small-scale fisheries units based on geography, gear type, and species. And here on the right, we have a figure breaking the different fishery units down based on the 5 variables that we looked at, as well as how that maps out to the FAO matrix score. And in this case, we ended up then doing that analysis both for all fisheries as well as non-trawl fisheries. And so the lighter color represents trawl fisheries here. Through this work, we've been able to develop a set of estimates for volume value, and I'll talk about drivers of change in a moment. This data was collected at the state level, and so we have estimates of total value and tonnage for each state. And then on the right, we have data estimating the total value and volume of the different of small scale fisheries based on these three types or three definitions of small scale, as well as when you exclude the trawl data. We ended up passing that off to the larger project team to make sense of it, integrated into this global analysis as they saw fit. But we felt that from where we stood as the developers of this case study, it was really important to provide that transparency in how we got to our numbers, and really let the data and the fisheries experts who helped us define small scale fisheries acknowledge those different perspectives and variable perspectives. One other piece I'll just touch on really briefly. As part of this work, we also asked about drivers of change. And this figure on this table on the bottom left speaks to the key drivers of change that were identified, and things like climate change and climate variability were really important, as well as loss of social capital and physical infrastructure, which have been key themes that we've heard at this conference. Really briefly, to sort of wrap up some of my own reflections on this experience, I wanted to share a set of what possibly could be viewed as policy recommendations here in the US based on our experience doing this work. The first one is around reviewing and amending the existing data confidentiality rules. In the US and I believe elsewhere, there are very strict rules around data confidentiality, and they're tied to the number of participants that engage in fisheries, or sometimes one step above at the dealer level. And what's interesting in this work is we lost track of a lot of data because of that confidentiality. And an observation is that through history, as fisheries in the US have consolidated more and more and more, we end up with this sort of positive correlation where you end up losing track of that confidentiality, or of that data, because of confidentiality rules. And I think if we're serious about attending to small scale fisheries and understanding how they're being impacted by policy changes, we need to reimagine, rethink what confidentiality means in the context of small scale fisheries. The second, and I think this is probably a theme that has been echoed loud and clear here, is this idea of establishing data collection systems that account for scale. In the case of this work, in so many instances, the data management structure appears to have been set up for other purposes, and scale is not one of those. As a result of that, we had to make a number of assumptions, make a number of estimates in building these numbers. And I think that could be corrected in future efforts if data collection systems were designed to attend to scale. The third one is around the set of sort of socioeconomic indicators of resilience, of sustainability. Through this work, we have a snapshot of the scale, the quite significant scale of small scale fisheries in the US, but I don't think that's enough. I think there's a need to track and monitor how these fisheries are performing, and especially thinking about it from a socioeconomic perspective. And there's a real need to develop a set of metrics, kind of like the Fish Stock Sustainability Index for total output, but thinking about it in the context of small scale and community-based fisheries. The fourth is more about representation and voice. In the last few years, the federal government has established a national policy liaison for the recreational fishing sector that has been an incredibly strong voice for that sector and getting better representation and getting better access to the fisheries. It strikes me as important that some similar position is created for small scale operators and community-based the fishing sector that creates a more direct pipeline between those on the ground experiencing fisheries in places like Maine and elsewhere, and the federal fisheries policymakers. And then the last point is about investing directly in the future of small scale the fishing sector. I think through this work, one of the big takeaways for me is that small scale fisheries represent an important part of the commercial fishing sector overall, and they're not. They're part of the existing system, and they shouldn't be treated as anti-modern or sort of a relic of the past, but an important part of communities, of culture and identity here in the US context, and should be invested in, just like we're investing in other marine sectors like wind and aquaculture. And then my last point, if I may, is that this work is ongoing. Our analysis is in review. Certainly the full work that Duke and WorldFish and FAO are doing is forthcoming. But from where I sit, it's already had an impact in the way that we are doing our work. And I would encourage those who are interested in learning more about how it's impacted our work to join us in the session later this evening, session 4.2, where we'll be talking about a new initiative that we're launching with congressional support to strengthen local and regional food systems. And I am quite serious when I say that this work wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the opportunity to participate in this global effort. So I'll end there and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this session.
Thank you so much, Josh, for all those insights into how to carry out the work at the country level. We now have time for questions and answers. I can see from the attendee list, we don't have a big crowd with us, but we have a few people. So if anyone of you would like to ask questions to our panelists, please type something into the Q&A or the chat. And the panelists stand ready to reply. While you may wait, we may wait for you to do that, I have a few questions myself up my sleeve that I would like to ask the panelists that I hope also is of interest to the rest of you. And I was wondering, Mar, if I could start with a question for you. And that has to do, and also relates then back to Josh's presentation, because it would be interesting to know a bit more how the countries were selected for the country case studies. You mentioned this a little bit, but maybe you could give a bit more detail on how it was decided which countries we wanted to look into in more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we actually applied a methodology that followed a list of selection criteria that considered both the country's absolute importance of the fishery sector, so at the global level, and relative importance as well, so at the country level, capita. So this helps us identify which were the priority countries we wanted to focus on. And the list of criteria, the different indicators we used were selected based on available data, such as fisheries production, so both absolute and per capita, employment in fisheries, role of fish protein for food security, that is in percent protein supply from fish products. And we also took into account geographic representation to make sure we had a good balance geographically. So using these available data, most of it came from FAO. We ranked countries based on the different criteria. And then, and then that way we just started targeting country by country, seeing if we were able to produce a case study, find the right experts to carry it out, etc. So that's how how we ended up with the 58 countries and territories in the end.
Thank you, Mar, for that additional information. Josh, maybe then, since we are on the country case studies, if I could ask you, what was the most surprising finding or result did you feel from your work in the US? I mean, you touched on this in your presentation, but maybe if you wanted to add a little bit on this. If there were particular lessons learned or things that you had just not expected to find that you discovered.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a hard question. I think I learned a lot through this process and continue to learn a lot through the process. And to me, I think one of the biggest surprises is the way that data is structured in the US process is largely not structured in a way to account for scale. And so we had to, in multiple cases, reach out to states and make special data requests because they would have data at a state level and you could get federal level data, but because they didn't separate by the size of vessels or where they're fishing in space, you get this collapsing of both larger scale and small scale operators. And so there's no way to tease that apart without going to a state government and saying, can you pull this data for us, especially? And that's not a practical way to be monitoring or paying attention to small scale operators. And I don't think I realized how big a lift it would be. And I think we had, like I said earlier, we had to make a lot of assumptions through the process anyways. But there's a real need for rethinking how we track data and archive data, I would say, to account for diverse scales.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I think you said also with regard to employment, there wasn't a lot of data, but there was information on the number of boats, but not necessarily of the number of people. And I think that was something that we struggled with also in other countries. So, John, I know for labor, you used a different approach somehow than only relying on the country case study data that you also mentioned. But I was wondering if you could give a bit more information on how you did that. And also with regards to subsistence, which is another important part of small-scale fisheries that we tend not to have information on.
Sure. No, we were able to pull together, and I don't think we'd done this at the global level before, but increasingly these standardized national household-based surveys that countries are conducting, they're typically labor force surveys that are conducted toward sort of a standardized process, standardized questionnaire, supported by the International Labor Organization for comparability, as well as the household income and expenditure surveys, they're called in some cases. All of these have been increasingly conducted by national governments over the last 10 plus years, 10 to 12 years, again, according to these standard procedures that give us data that's comparable across countries so that we could generate this larger data set. And that's what we were able to find for 78 countries. We were able to access these the original data on these household surveys that were conducted. And these surveys would ask questions about, what is your profession, what employment, so you could see how many people are employed in fisheries. But then they would also ask in some cases, did you, as a sub question on there, did you fish for your own consumption? And so you could start to see, okay, this person is listed here as having fished for their own consumption, for subsistence, not for receiving remuneration or being considered employed. And so those were two very specific terms and concepts used by the ILO and defined, whether it's employment for some form of remuneration for your work, or subsistence where you're working for your own consumption. And the questions allowed us to get get data on both of those across all of these countries, and then we extrapolated up to the global level on that basis.
Thanks a lot, John. I don't see any additional questions from those of you who are attending. So I think maybe we could call it a day for this now, with the presentation and this discussion we had at the end. I hope those of you who have been here that you enjoyed it. This is also being recorded, so it can be watched later. And we really believe that the IHH is an important contribution to improving data collection, analysis of small-scale fisheries, and going beyond what is usually business as usual, which is what we heard here also quite specifically from the US country case studies that there is a need to start looking at things in a different way. We have the small-scale fisheries guidelines, and that provides the policy framework for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries, and that's a very valid tool that the IHH study supports. So hopefully with the new data and insights, that will also promote the further implementation of the small-scale fisheries guidelines. And I also would like to take this opportunity then to wish you all a happy International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture, and hope you will join in continuing celebrating this further in this year 2022. So with that, thank you very much, and thanks also to all that have contributed to this study. I think we calculated there have been some 800 people involved in one way or another. So without all of you, that would not have been possible, of course. We're very grateful. And yes, look forward to the report coming out later this year. Thank you very much.